I learned early that silence can bruise deeper than words. For years, I kept mine, thinking if I just stayed quiet, he'd see me, maybe even respect me. But in my father's world, being quiet only meant being invisible. He never hit me. He didn't need to. Every dismissive glance, every sentence that ended with, "You'll understand when you grow up," carved something out of me that never grew back. I tried to make peace with it, to believe that love could survive without being acknowledged. But the day he stood in court and called me a disgrace to this family, something in me finally cracked, not from the insult itself, but from realizing how long I had let him define my worth. That was the moment I stopped waiting for him to see who I was, because the truth, what he doesn't know yet, will make him see me whether he wants to or not. Charleston, South Carolina. The air that morning felt thick enough to drown in, humid, heavy, salted like the breath of the sea. The courthouse smelled of damp wood and something older, like the ghosts of too many verdicts. The ceiling fan above groaned with each turn, its slow rhythm the only sound before the storm began. People filled the benches, neighbors, faces I hadn't seen since high school, the same ones who'd whispered when I left this town. Their murmurs swelled and then hushed as the door opened and he walked in. My father. The sound of his boots hitting the wooden floorboards felt like a judgment already passed. He didn't look at me. He never did. He moved with that same rigid pride that had ruled our house for as long as I could remember, as if the air itself should step aside for him. His silver hair caught the light from the window, and for one moment, I saw not the man who raised me, but the man who taught me what silence could cost. When he spoke, the room quivered. "She's a disgrace to this family." The words split through the air like gunfire. A woman in the back flinched. A man beside her whispered something under his breath. I didn't move. My hands were clasped loosely in front of me, my posture straight, unflinching. Years in the service had trained me for chaos, for the roar of men who mistook volume for power. But nothing had prepared me for the way his voice, my own father's voice, echoed like a verdict inside my ribs. I could feel every eye in the room crawl over me, waiting for me to break. But I'd already done that, long ago, quietly, in ways no one had seen. The floorboards beneath my shoes were scarred, the varnish worn thin by generations of boots. I stared at them, tracing the cracks the way I once traced the lines on my mother's hands. Somewhere between those grains of wood were the remnants of a family that had long since splintered. My father, my brother, and the woman who'd tried to hold us together until her own heart gave out. The judge, Richard Avery, sat at the bench, unmoving. He was older, with the kind of stillness that came from having seen too much. He lifted his glasses, studying my father the way one studies a man who's about to walk into his own downfall. The silence stretched until it felt alive, pressing against the walls. Then his voice, low and deliberate, cut through it. "Sir, you really don't know, do you?" The sound landed heavy, like a gavel before the gavel. The spectators shifted, uncertain, glancing between us. My father's jaw locked. Confusion flashed across his face for the briefest second. And in that second, something inside me shifted too. For years, he had built his own truth out of arrogance and authority, out of the kind of certainty that leaves no space for love. And for years, I had let him. I'd learned how to be small enough not to threaten him, quiet enough not to anger him. But standing there, in that courtroom that smelled of salt and old wood, I realized something simple and irrevocable. He no longer had the power to name who I was. The judge's words still hung in the air, unanswered. My father straightened, trying to recover his composure. He didn't see it yet. The shift, the slow unraveling of the narrative he'd carried for decades. I could feel my heartbeat steady, slow, and deliberate, the rhythm of the ocean, the rhythm of resolve, because this wasn't just about a will. It wasn't about money or land, or even the name on the door of the family business. It was about truth, the kind he'd buried under pride and denial. It was about a man who had spent his life teaching me the meaning of honor while never living it himself. And though he didn't know it yet, This courtroom would be where that contradiction ended. Outside, the faint cry of a gull broke through the air. Inside, no one spoke. The room held its breath. The judge's gaze lingered on my father. Waiting. My father said nothing. He couldn't. And me, I stood still, feeling the shift beneath my skin, the quiet certainty that everything he believed about control, about dominance, about family, was already beginning to collapse. He just didn't know it yet. Charleston never smelled like sugar or summer fairs. It smelled like salt, oil, and the paint that clung to the hulls of old fishing boats. My childhood tasted the same, rough, metallic, always just a little bitter. The house by the river was more workshop than home, filled with the noise of engines and the rhythm of my father's commands. Thomas Hart lived by rules carved in iron. He quoted them the way some men quote scripture: discipline, obedience, legacy. He built boats and raised his children the same way, by hammering until they held their shape. The company sign above the dock said Hart and Sons, and every time he pointed to it, he emphasized that last word like a prayer he didn't know, excluded half his family. My brother, Rowan, fit neatly into that world. He was steady, easy to please, the kind of son who knew how to answer yes, sir, before the question even finished. He carried our father's pride like a medal. I didn't. I was the question that never stopped asking, the one who preferred books over blueprints, court cases over currents. I wanted to understand how things worked, not just repeat how they'd always been done. To my father, that curiosity wasn't strength. It was defiance dressed in politeness. One humid afternoon, I sat on the dock, reading under the shade of a half-built sailboat. My father walked past, noticed the open book in my lap, and in one quick motion, he snatched it and threw it into the river. The splash was sharp, final. "You'll drown in your own questions one day," he said. He turned back toward the workshop, his boots thudding against the planks. I watched the book sink, the water swallowing the words one by one, until only ripples remained. That night, my mother came into my room. The air still smelled faintly of varnish and rain. She set a chipped teacup on my nightstand, the way she always did when she wanted to say something without my father hearing. Her voice was soft, steady. "Your father doesn't know how to talk to brave things." I didn't understand what she meant then, but years later, after watching her stand quiet in every argument, after seeing her fold herself smaller each time he raised his voice, I realized she hadn't been talking about me at all. A year later, a letter came from Annapolis. The envelope bore the seal of the United States Naval Academy. My hand shook when I opened it. Acceptance. A full scholarship. I thought for once, he might be proud. That night, at dinner, I slid the letter across the table. Rowan looked impressed. My father didn't. He finished his meal in silence, set down his fork, and stood. His voice was even, colder than I'd ever heard. A woman's place is on shore, not commanding men at sea. No one moved. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the dock outside. He left the room without looking at me. My mother's hand hovered over mine, light as the dust on the table, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The next morning, before dawn, I packed a single duffel bag. My father didn't come downstairs. The house smelled like coffee and silence. My mother followed me to the porch, her robe pulled tight against the morning chill. She pressed a folded bill, 2 50s, into my palm, along with a small photograph of the river behind our house. The edges were soft from handling. "Go where your strength is seen." "L," she whispered. I wanted to hug her, but I didn't. In our house, love lived in small gestures, not grand ones. I turned toward the bus stop at the end of the road. The sky was pale, the horizon washed in that gray-blue light that only happens before sunrise. When I looked back, she was still there, one hand raised, the other gripping her robe like it was all that kept her standing. That was the last time I heard her voice without hospital walls between us. The bus pulled away, and the town disappeared behind the bend of the river. I remember thinking that leaving would finally make me free of him. Of all of it. The noise, the orders, the weight of a name carved into every boat and every expectation. But freedom doesn't come that easily, even miles away. I carried him in the way I walked, the way I clenched my jaw when someone doubted me, the way I mistook silence for strength. I didn't know it then, but every question he tried to drown in me was still alive, waiting for the day I'd stop asking why and start asking when. When would he finally see what I had become? When would I stop caring if he ever did? By the time the bus reached the highway, the salt in the air had already begun to fade, but its taste stayed with me, lodged deep in my throat, the same way truth does when you've been told too long not to speak it. The letters started coming the month I left Charleston. They were always in the same pale blue envelopes, my mother's looping handwriting steady across the front. I could smell her before I even opened them, the faint trace of sea salt, lavender soap, and something warm that reminded me of home. She wrote about the little things, the wildflowers that grew along the fence behind the house, how the gulls came in closer when the tides turned warm, how Rowan had gotten engaged to a girl from Savannah. She always ended with the same line. Your father is working late again. He's well, but she never wrote that he asked about me, because he didn't. I read each letter carefully, then folded it into thirds and slid it into the tin box I kept under my bunk. Every time I opened that box, it felt like cracking open a door I wasn't sure I wanted to step through. There was one letter I never opened. The last one. It arrived on my birthday, wrapped in brown paper, sealed tighter than the rest. I carried it through 3 deployments, 2 transfers, and 12 different bases. The paper yellowed, the corners bent, but I never broke the seal. Some things, I told myself, you don't read until you're ready to forgive. Years blurred into missions, cases, and the rhythm of the uniform. I learned how to hold my voice steady when the room shook. I learned how to argue facts without letting emotion slip through. As a JAG attorney, I spoke for those who couldn't, fought for soldiers who had no one else to stand beside them. In the process, I became something my father would never have tolerated, a woman whose voice carried weight. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about how he would react if he saw me in court, cross-examining a colonel twice my age, or arguing before a military board of inquiry. He used to say women couldn't lead men. I had built a career out of proving him wrong, even if he'd never know it. Then, one evening, the call came. I was reviewing case files in a base office in San Diego when the phone rang. The nurse's voice was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. Your mother's in the hospital. It's serious. I was on the next flight home. The Charleston air hit me like memory, heavy and salt-thick, clinging to my uniform as I walked through the sliding doors of the hospital. I found her in a narrow room overlooking the marshes. The machines hummed. The light from the window washed her skin pale. But when her eyes opened, she smiled. My Elle, you came. Her voice was little more than breath, but it carried the same warmth it always had. I took her hand. It was cold, but steady. For 2 weeks, I stayed. I read aloud from her favorite books, adjusted the pillows, watched the tide from her window. We talked about the garden, the house, Rowan's engagement. We never talked about my father. He came only once, stood in the doorway, nodded at me, and said nothing. Even then, he couldn't bring himself to look at us together. When she died, it was quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't end. It settles. I remember the sound of the heart monitor flatlining, the nurse whispering condolences, and the way my father stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes dry. At the funeral, he didn't take my hand. When it was over, he walked beside me down the church steps and said, almost politely, "You can go back to your Navy now." It wasn't cruelty. It was dismissal, the only language he knew. I left Charleston that same night. I told myself I wouldn't come back again, but grief doesn't stay where you leave it. It travels, quiet, patient, waiting for the next knock at the door. 3 months later, that knock came. I was in my office when the call from Gregory Miles came through. He'd been my mother's attorney for years, the kind of man who still used a fountain pen and believed truth should always be written down. His voice was low and deliberate. The way people speak when they know the news they carry will rearrange the ground beneath your feet. Your mother changed her will before she passed, he said. Half the estate goes to you. Your father's contesting it. For a long time, I said nothing. The words didn't fit together. My mother, careful to the end, had left something not just in trust, but in defiance. A final act of quiet rebellion against a man who'd silenced both of us in different ways. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me. It was calm, almost steady. Why? Gregory hesitated. Then he said, because she wanted you to have something with your name on it, something he couldn't take away. The line went quiet again, but I could hear the weight of it, the truth that love sometimes leaves in secret, not out of fear, but out of mercy. That night, I found the tin box again. I emptied it out, spread every letter across the bed. The ink had faded, but her words still felt alive. And at the bottom, that last unopened one stared back at me, the seal unbroken. I held it in my hands for a long time. Outside, rain tapped against the window, soft and persistent. I thought about the house by the river, the sound of my father's voice, the way she used to smooth my hair when he wasn't looking. For years, she'd tried to protect both of us from him, me from his disappointment, him from his own reflection. And in the end, she'd done it again, leaving behind a document that spoke louder than she ever could in life. Half the estate. It wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement. About saying, I see you, even if he never does. I placed the unopened letter back into the box, closed the lid, and let the silence stretch around me. Somewhere in that silence, I felt her presence, not as comfort, but as a promise. She had drawn a line that my father would try to erase, and whether I wanted it or not, I knew I'd have to defend it. The first war I ever fought wasn't in uniform. It started in that house by the river. And this time, I wasn't planning to lose. 3 months after the funeral, just as I was preparing to return to the base in San Diego, a thick envelope arrived at my temporary address. My name was typed in bold, and beneath it, the words that made my stomach turn cold. Thomas Hart v. Elowen Hart, Contest of Will. For a moment, I just stared at it, my thumb tracing the edge of the paper. The letters looked unreal, like something belonging to another family. Then I opened it, and there it was in black and white. My father had sued me. There was no anger at first, just a strange, hollow disbelief. The man who'd taught me to salute, to speak only when spoken to, the man who had spent a lifetime equating control with love, had now turned that same discipline into a weapon. According to Navy protocol, any JAG officer involved in a civil dispute had to submit their service record to the court. I followed orders. I didn't think twice about it. I didn't realize that the file, my record of years spent fighting for others, would become the very evidence he'd use to fight against me. Charleston greeted me with its usual suffocating summer heat. The air hung heavy with the smell of algae and salt. I rented a small apartment near the Ashley River, just a few blocks from where the house used to feel like home. The locals had already heard. Charleston was small that way. Gossip moved faster than the tide. At the coffee shop by the harbor, I caught the glances, the whispers. The Navy girl's back. Wants her mother's money. They said it like I'd come to steal, not to defend what was mine. In a town like this, reputation was currency, and my father still owned most of it. Gregory Miles's office hadn't changed much since I was a child. The same brick walls, the same dusty law books, the same smell of old paper and lemon polish. He stood as I entered, his face lined with years and sympathy. He laid a thick file on the desk between us. His tone was measured, cautious, as though he was preparing me for impact. Your father's claiming your mother wasn't of sound mind when she revised her will. I felt my jaw tighten. I let out a short, humorless laugh. He's calling her unstable now? That's new? Gregory's eyes flickered. Pity, maybe regret. He also mortgaged the company months before she passed. If this goes public, it'll ruin him, reputation, business, maybe even the house. It hit me then, with an almost physical clarity. This wasn't about inheritance. This was about dominance, about keeping control even when the person he'd spent his life controlling was gone. He wasn't trying to protect her memory. He was protecting his name. Gregory's voice softened. He's not just fighting you, Elle. He's fighting the truth of who your mother was. I nodded, slow and quiet. Then we'll let the truth speak for itself. As we combed through the documents, Gregory paused, his brow furrowed as he pulled out a sealed envelope from the bottom of a stack, labeled in faint handwriting, E. Heart. Confidential. It wasn't logged in the court's index. His secretary swore she hadn't seen it before. We opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten draft of my mother's will, dated just days before her death. Her handwriting was clear, deliberate, every letter sharp. She had known exactly what she wanted. Half the estate to me, half to my brother. No confusion, no instability. But the signature page, her fingerprint seal, was smudged, almost wiped clean. Gregory frowned. This shouldn't look like that, he murmured. Someone tried to alter it. A chill ran through me. The smell of the salt air outside turned sour in my mouth. Someone had touched the last thing my mother ever wrote, and I didn't need to guess who would gain from that. We didn't speak for a long time. The sound of the ceiling fan filled the room, slow and rhythmic. Finally, I said quietly. He's rewriting her even after she's gone. Gregory exhaled through his nose. Then we'll make sure her voice is louder. That night, I walked past the family shipyard. The sign still read Heart and Sons, the white paint fading, but the arrogance intact. Inside, the lights were on. Through the window, I saw my father sitting at his old wooden desk, the same one where he used to make me stand still while he delivered lectures about duty. I stepped inside. The smell of sawdust and varnish hit me like memory. He didn't look up right away. His pen scraped across paper, always working, always in control. When he finally spoke, his tone was flat, almost rehearsed. You can still walk away, Elawan, before you embarrass this family further. His voice had that same mix of command and contempt it always carried. I remembered being 16, being told not to talk back, to know my place, but I wasn't 16 anymore. I stood in the doorway, calm, steady, my voice low. Embarrassment isn't hereditary. Dad, it's a choice. For the first time. He looked up at me. His jaw flexed, eyes narrowing. That sharp marine stare that once made grown men step back. Then, his fist slammed down on the table. The sound cracked through the air, rattling the papers and tools. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence between us was no longer built from fear. It was built from recognition. I turned to leave. The night outside was thick with the sound of crickets and the slow slap of waves against the dock. The air carried the same ache as my chest. Tight, heavy, but awake. As I walked away, I realized this fight wasn't new. It had started years ago, the first time I dared to question him, the first time I decided to be someone he couldn't mold. He had spent a lifetime building boats strong enough to survive any tide, but he'd never learned how to weather the truth. And now, for the first time, he was about to face a storm that carried his own last name. 2 weeks before the hearing, the air in Charleston had turned thick and restless, like the whole town knew a storm was coming. I was sitting by the window of the small room I'd rented, the sound of the river muffled by the steady hum of the fan, when there was a knock at the door. Gregory stood outside, his shirt damp from the heat, a small box tucked under his arm. He set it down on the table without a word. His eyes had that same look he wore the day he told me about the will. Careful, heavy, as though he already knew what this would cost me to see. I opened the box. Inside was a USB drive, labeled in my mother's handwriting. For Elawan, private. The label alone made my throat tighten. My hands trembled slightly as I plugged it into my laptop. The screen flickered, then steadied into an image that made my breath catch. She was sitting by the window of her office, light falling across her shoulders, her hair thinner than I remembered. She looked fragile, but her eyes were still sharp. When she spoke, her voice carried that soft, deliberate tone that always made people listen. "If you're watching this, Elle, it means your father turned anger into armor again. Don't fight him for revenge. Fight him for the truth." Her voice wavered slightly on the last word, but she didn't look away from the camera. The sound of waves in the background, probably from the marsh outside her window, filled the silence between her breaths. I could hear my own heartbeat syncing with it, steady, painful. When the video ended, I just sat there, staring at the black screen. Gregory's voice was quiet, almost reverent. That video alone could end the case. But I knew better. It wasn't just evidence, it was a message, a final piece of her that she'd left behind not to help me win, but to make sure I didn't lose myself in the process. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her voice in my head, every syllable carving into me. I wanted to believe I could follow her advice, that I could fight for truth instead of vengeance, but truth and vengeance were starting to look the same. The next afternoon, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Rowan. He looked smaller somehow, like someone who'd been carrying a weight he couldn't put down. He didn't meet my eyes. "He's making me testify against you, Elle," he said quietly. "If he loses, everything falls apart. The company, the house, his reputation. He says you manipulated Mom." I felt a bitter smile pull at my mouth. "And you believe that?" Rowan hesitated, his lips parted, then closed again. I don't know what to believe anymore. That was the thing about Rowan. He was never cruel, just weak. And in our family, weakness wasn't forgiven. It was punished. When he left, I sat in silence, staring at the empty chair he'd just vacated. The truth was, I didn't hate him. I pitied him. He was still trying to survive in my father's world, where loyalty mattered more than conscience. But I had already left that world once. I wasn't going back. Later that night, I opened the old photo box I'd taken from my mother's things. Most of it was filled with the usual: birthdays, family picnics, stiff smiles. But near the bottom, folded in half, was one photograph that stopped me cold. It was from my first JAG graduation ceremony. I was standing in uniform, my mother beside me, her hand on my shoulder. She was beaming. In the corner of the photograph, written in her familiar script, were the words, "He'll never understand this uniform, but it's the truest part of you." I traced the ink with my finger. The paper was soft from age, the letters smudged in places. A tear landed on the photo before I realized it had fallen. For years, I'd been fighting for them, for his approval, for her memory, for the family name. But as I sat there, I realized something I hadn't dared to admit before. I'd never fought for myself. The next morning, Gregory arrived with a new envelope. He looked both confused and concerned. It had been delivered anonymously to his office. Inside was a copy of my mother's life insurance policy, signed 1 week before she died. At the bottom of the document was a medical statement declaring her of sound mind and full awareness. There was no name, no address, no clue as to who had sent it. Just a small note scrawled in a different hand. She knew. I turned the paper over, reading the words again and again. She knew. My mother had known what was coming. She'd known he would fight, that he would twist her final wishes into something ugly, and she'd prepared for it. The realization sent a shiver through me. Grief had made me think of her as a victim, but maybe she was something else entirely. Maybe she was the quiet architect of the truth he couldn't bury. That night, as I tried to piece together what all of it meant, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, shaky. "Miss Hart? You don't know me. I used to work at the county clerk's office." I sat up, my pulse quickening. "Some files in your mother's case were replaced the day after her funeral. Check the witness page." The line went dead before I could ask anything else. I opened my laptop, pulled up the scanned copy of the will, and zoomed in on the witness section. The signature there didn't match the one from the handwritten draft Gregory had found. Different loops, different pressure. My stomach dropped. The name listed was Carol Minton, my father's former accountant, a woman I remembered vaguely from childhood dinners at the shipyard. Always quiet, always nervous. She died in a car accident not long after the funeral. The coincidence was too perfect to be coincidence at all. I sat there for a long time, staring at her name, feeling the cold creep up my spine. He'd done it, or someone had done it for him. Either way, my mother's truth had been tampered with, twisted, buried under the same kind of silence he'd always used to keep us in line. When I finally looked up from the screen, the clock read past midnight. The air was still, heavy, and I could hear the faint rush of the river outside. I thought of my mother's words from the video. Don't fight him for revenge. Fight him for the truth. I had thought truth would be clean, but now I saw it for what it was. A battlefield. As I shut my laptop, my reflection stared back at me in the dark glass. Tired eyes, set jaw, the ghost of a woman who looked too much like her mother. The case was no longer about inheritance. It wasn't even about justice. It was about honor. His version built on control, mine built on truth. Two different meanings, two different weapons, and soon, both would be tested in the only place left that still held our family name, the courtroom. 2 weeks before the hearing, Charleston woke up to my father's face on the front page. Local veteran defends family legacy against estranged daughter. The photo was taken at the shipyard, him standing tall beside one of the boats, hand on his hip, jaw set, like a man guarding the last thing he owned. Beneath it, the quote cut deep. My daughter serves the Navy, not her family. It wasn't just a headline. It was a declaration of war. He wasn't arguing in court anymore. He was rallying the town to his side. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. The old familiar ache crawled back. The same feeling I used to get as a kid whenever he'd turn his disappointment into a sermon. The people of Charleston loved him. He was their symbol of discipline and pride. And now, I was the traitor who'd come home to tear that symbol apart. By noon, I was standing outside the old wooden house by the river, the one that still smelled of varnish and salt and childhood fear. The boards creaked as I stepped inside. Dust hung in the sunlight like smoke. He was there, at the kitchen table, cleaning his old rifle, every motion deliberate, controlled. He always reached for that gun when he felt threatened, not because he needed it, but because it reminded him of who he used to be. The air was thick, still, waiting. I broke it first. I'm not here to argue. He didn't look up. Then you came to lose. His voice was calm, almost quiet, and that made it worse. I stood there, my pulse steady, but my throat tight. You taught me honor, Dad, but you forgot what it means. He finally met my eyes. There was no softness there, just the sharp edge of a man who'd built his whole life around control. You learned obedience. That's not honor. No, I learned discipline. There's a difference. His hand froze on the rifle, his knuckles white. You're embarrassing your mother's memory. I took a breath that felt like it might break me. No, Dad, you're erasing it. The words hit him like a slap. His face tightened, and for a moment, I saw something behind the anger, fear, maybe, but it vanished just as quickly. He stood, his jaw flexing, and then the crash came. The coffee cup hit the wall, shattered, pieces scattering across the floor like a dozen unfinished arguments. I didn't flinch. When I turned toward the door, I felt his stare burning into my back. But I didn't look back. I closed the door softly behind me and stood on the porch, the smell of coffee and gun oil clinging to my clothes. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I wasn't angry, either. I was just sorry. Sorry that he'd rather break everything than admit he didn't know how to love what he couldn't control. The phone rang just as I reached my car. Gregory's voice came through, tense but steady. "Elle, the case has a new judge assignment, Richard Avery." I froze. The name hit like a current. The same Avery who served with my mother? Exactly. He's known for being fair, but he remembers her. A strange chill ran through me. Not dread, not relief, just something electric. The woman my father had tried to erase from every memory was now the reason the scales might finally tilt toward justice. That night, I sat by the river outside the motel. The water was calm, the surface glinting under the yellow streetlight. I opened my mother's old notebook, the one Gregory had found among her files. The pages smelled faintly of sea air and ink. Near the middle, her handwriting curved across the paper. The law protects truth. Love protects the people telling it. I ran my thumb along the words, hearing her voice again, gentle but unyielding. I understood now. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about property or legal definitions. It would be about her memory, about proving she had lived and died with her mind and her dignity intact. The case wasn't about wealth. It was about witness, about truth surviving the man who tried to rewrite it. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and rain. I looked out at the dark water, knowing that somewhere on the other side of this fight was peace, but I'd have to walk through fire to reach it. The next morning, an envelope slipped under my door woke me before dawn. No return address, no markings except my name in neat handwriting. I tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper with one line written in blue ink. Ask Rowan what really happened the night Mom collapsed. I stared at it for a long time. My pulse quickened. The handwriting, it was eerily familiar, rounded, graceful, almost like hers. For a split second, the air left my lungs. I grabbed my phone and called Rowan. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. Whoever sent that note knew something. Maybe it was him, maybe it was someone else. But whoever it was, they just cracked open a door I didn't even know existed. I set the note down on the table, the paper trembling slightly in the draft from the window. If it was true, if there was more to that night than we'd been told, it meant the entire foundation of my father's defense might collapse. The handwriting haunted me. I picked up the note again, holding it against the light. Every loop, every slant. My mother's hand had looked like that, precise, measured, a teacher's hand. But she was gone. Still, some part of me couldn't shake the feeling that she was still here, guiding me the way she always had, quietly, unseen, just enough to point me toward the truth. The river outside rippled under the wind, the current moving faster now, pushing toward the ocean. I thought of the headline that morning, of my father's proud, defiant face on the front page, and for the first time, I wasn't angry about it, because deep down, I knew, the louder he tried to shout, the closer he was to losing control. And maybe that was what scared him most. Not me, not the will, not even the truth. It was the realization that the woman he'd spent his life silencing had found a way to keep speaking. Through me. And whether he liked it or not. Her voice was about to be heard. The night before the hearing, rain came hard and endless. It blurred the streetlights, soaked the moss hanging from the oaks, and turned Charleston into a gray reflection of itself. The air was heavy with salt and damp wind, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. Gregory and I sat in the motel room, surrounded by stacks of paper, case files, medical reports, copies of the will. The hum of the rain filled every silence between us. I tried to read, but the words wouldn't settle. My mind kept circling back to that note slipped under my door. Ask Rowan what really happened the night Mom collapsed. I'd called him 3 times since morning. No answer. Now. As the clock edged past 10, I tried again. The line clicked. Then his voice came through, thin and shaky. Elle, there's something you don't know. Tell me. That night, when Mom collapsed, Dad told me not to call you. He said you had your own life now, that you didn't need to come back. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. You obeyed him? I didn't want to make things worse. I thought she'd recover. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain hitting the window, hard and fast, like 100 small fists. When I spoke, my voice came out small. Rowan. She died thinking I didn't care. His breath hitched on the other end. He told me she didn't want to see you. I believed him. I was wrong. There was nothing left to say. The sound between us was the sound of regret. Thin, fragile, too late. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet that followed. The kind of quiet that presses against your ribs until it hurts to breathe. My father hadn't just stolen her will. He had stolen my last chance to say goodbye. A knock came at the door. Gregory stepped in, water dripping from his coat, holding a manila folder. He set it on the table. "A new document just came through," he said softly. "The hospital finally released your mother's full medical record. Inside was a single page, clean, official, impossible to argue with." My eyes scanned the lines. Patient remained alert and coherent until cardiac arrest. Repeatedly requested her daughter be contacted. Communication denied by family representative. The signature at the bottom stopped me cold. Thomas Hart. My father had signed the form that refused my mother's final request. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. The anger that had followed me for years wasn't there anymore. What replaced it was worse: emptiness. A hollow space where something sacred had been scraped out. When Gregory left, I stayed at the table, staring at that page until the ink blurred. Then I reached into the tin box I'd carried for years and pulled out the last unopened letter. The paper was brittle, yellowed at the edges. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Her handwriting was the same as always. Careful, graceful, each word chosen like she knew this would be her last. "If he ever turns his anger against you, defend yourself, but never let his hatred define you. Forgive him when you can, not when he asks." I read it twice, then folded it gently, pressing it flat with my palm. Forgiveness. I wasn't sure I was capable of that anymore. But maybe forgiveness wasn't about letting him off the hook. Maybe it was about freeing myself from the weight of everything he'd done. Outside, thunder rolled far off over the water. I stood by the window, watching the lights from the Ravenel Bridge stretch across the harbor like veins of gold running through darkness. The reflection on the water looked like a promise. Distant, flickering, but alive. Somewhere beyond that bridge was a courtroom waiting to split our family name in two. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might happen there. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a mist. Gregory knocked again, this time with a paper clenched in his hand, his expression unreadable. He held out the page, a fax. "Rowan just called the court," he said. "He's withdrawing his testimony for your father." I froze. My heart stumbled, caught between relief and disbelief. "He did?" Gregory nodded. His eyes softened. He said, "I can't lie anymore." For a moment, everything inside me stopped. The noise, the ache, the exhaustion. Then it all came rushing back at once, sharp and bright. Rowan, the son my father had built his legacy on, the one who'd carried his pride like a banner, had finally stepped out from under his shadow. It didn't erase the years of silence, but it was something. It was truth finding its way through the cracks. I sank into the chair, the fax still warm in my hands. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled and meant it. The fight ahead would still be brutal, but for the first time, it wouldn't just be me standing in that courtroom. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first real shift in the tide. The morning of the hearing was suffocating. Charleston simmered under a heavy sky, the air thick with humidity and the faint tang of salt drifting in from the harbor. The courthouse windows were half open, but the air inside still felt trapped, stale, and expectant, like the whole building knew it was about to witness something it couldn't unsee. I sat at the defense table, my hands flat against the wood, the grain smooth beneath my palms. Gregory sat beside me, calm but alert, his notes neatly stacked, his pen perfectly aligned. Across the aisle, my father stood tall, flanked by his attorney, Graham Pierce. Even after everything, he still looked unshakable, chin lifted, jaw tight, the posture of a man convinced that righteousness was a matter of stance. Behind us, the room was packed. Neighbors, old friends, men from the shipyard, even strangers who had read the headlines. They hadn't come for me. They'd come for him. the man Charleston still called Captain Hart, when the bailiff called the court to order. The door at the far end opened, and Judge Richard Avery entered. He was older now, his hair nearly white, but his presence filled the room like a tide rolling in. I recognized the quiet authority in his movements, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. He'd served with my mother once, back when she worked with the Military Legal Board. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw a flicker of recognition, not favoritism, but understanding. The look of a man who had seen honor twisted into something it was never meant to be. He took his seat, removed his glasses, and nodded to the clerk. The gavel struck once. Pierce rose first. His voice carried that polished Southern cadence that made everything sound noble, even cruelty. Your Honor, today we will prove that Miss Hart manipulated her dying mother, exploited her illness, and violated the sanctity of her own family. He paused for effect, gesturing toward me. My father sat behind him, head held high, nodding slightly at each accusation, as though agreeing with scripture. Gregory didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch until the words lost their echo. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, his tone even but firm. Your Honor, we intend to show that Mrs. Eleanor Hart was of clear and sound mind when she revised her will, and that her wishes were deliberate and informed. We have documentation, a recorded statement, and medical testimony to support it. The judge nodded. The words hung between us, heavy as the air. I didn't look at my father, but I could feel his stare, sharp, burning, trying to pierce through years of distance. He wasn't afraid of losing money. He was afraid of being wrong. Gregory turned toward the screen. The lights dimmed, and the first image flickered into focus. My mother. She sat by the window of her office, light washing across her face. Her voice was faint, the oxygen tube visible against her cheek, but her eyes were bright and sure. If you're watching this, Elle, it means your father turned anger into armor again. Don't fight him for revenge. Fight him for the truth. The room went silent. I could hear the soft, uneven breaths of the people behind us, the creak of the old ceiling fan. Even the judge's hand froze halfway to his glasses. My father's eyes darted to the screen, then to me, then away again. When the video ended, the silence was too much for him. He shot to his feet, voice booming. That's not her! That's edited! She wasn't in her right mind. The words ricocheted through the room. The judge's gavel slammed down. Mr. Hart, sit down. He did. But the damage was done. The crowd had seen what I'd lived with my whole life, a man who mistook fury for conviction. Gregory called for the next exhibit. He handed the judge a folder and spoke with the precision of a man who'd prepared for every storm. This is Mrs. Hart's medical file, Your Honor. It confirms she was coherent until the day of her death. The attending physician recorded multiple attempts by the patient to contact her daughter, which were denied. By a family representative. Judge Avery adjusted his glasses. Who signed as representative? Gregory's voice didn't waver. Thomas Hart. A murmur rippled through the room. My father's jaw clenched. The judge motioned for him to remain seated, but I could see the tremor in his hands. Gregory continued, sliding another document forward. Additionally, Your Honor, the notary and witness, Mrs. Carol Minton, verified this will 3 days before Mrs. Hart's heart attack. Her written notes confirm the decedent's clarity and intent. We also have evidence that the signatures in the public record were tampered with after her death. The sound in the courtroom changed. Gasps, whispers, the creak of shifting bodies. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air felt too thick, my pulse too loud. The judge leaned forward, studying my father. Mr. Hart, do you wish to respond? And that was when everything cracked open. My father stood, face flushed, eyes bright with something between rage and shame. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound like a gunshot. She's a disgrace to this family. She left. She doesn't deserve anything from us. The outburst rang through the chamber, louder than the rain outside, louder than my heartbeat. For a second, no one breathed. I didn't rise. I didn't speak. I just sat there, spine straight, fingers tight around the edge of the table, because I knew I didn't have to say a word. He was doing it for me. Every shout, every insult, every ounce of his fury was proof of everything I'd tried to tell the world. The judge took off his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried through every corner of the room. "Sir, you really don't know, do you?" My father blinked. Confused. "Your daughter has served this country for 12 years in the United States Navy JAG Corps. She has defended sailors, prosecuted fraud, and upheld the very justice you claim to value. The only disgrace here, Mr. Hart, is denying what she has become." The words struck the air like thunder. Someone in the back gasped. A few people lowered their eyes. My father just stood there, as if the sound had knocked the breath out of him. For once, the room didn't belong to him. The judge's gavel came down one last time. "The will stands. Contest dismissed. Court is adjourned." It took a second for me to realize it was over. I let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a weight you didn't know you were carrying finally lifts. My hands trembled slightly on the table. Gregory leaned toward me, voice low. She'd be proud. I nodded, eyes still on my father. He hadn't moved. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. The proud, unshakable man, who'd spent a lifetime defining everyone else, had finally been stripped bare. By the truth, by the court, by his own words. As the crowd began to file out, I turned toward the window. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, its light glinting off the harbor. The air still smelled of salt, but this time, it was clean, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a daughter or a soldier or an argument to be won, just as myself. Somewhere, I hoped, she was watching. And maybe, just maybe, she finally knew that I had fought exactly the way she asked me to. For the truth, the house by the river hadn't changed, but it felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer around the memories still trapped inside. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of wood rot and salt. I walked through the quiet rooms, the floorboards creaking under my steps, until I reached the chair by the window where my mother used to sit. The cushion still held its dent, the fabric faintly worn where her hands had rested. I pulled open the desk drawer, and there it was. The real letter. The paper was yellowed, edges soft from age. The ink bled in places, as if it had been touched by rain or tears. Her handwriting tilted gently across the page, familiar and steady even now. L. If he ever drags you into his storms, don't let him decide what kind of woman you are. Defend what's yours, but never let hate guide your hands. His pride isn't your inheritance. Your peace is. I read it once, then again. The last line slowed my heartbeat, its weight sinking deep into me. She'd known, somehow. She'd seen this moment coming. The fight, the reckoning, the aftermath. And she'd prepared me, not with instructions, but with peace. I set the letter down and looked around the room. The same photographs still lined the mantel, my father holding Rowan in front of the shipyard, my mother smiling from beside them, and me, half hidden behind her shoulder, cropped out by the edge of the frame. For years, I'd looked at that photo and seen proof of my place, half visible, half forgotten. Now, standing there, I reached for it. The glass was cool under my fingers. I wiped the dust away and looked closer. For the first time, I didn't see the child left out of the picture. I saw the woman who had stepped beyond it. I had spent so many years trying to be seen, to be recognized, to be understood by him. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped realizing I already was, by the only person who ever truly mattered. As I slid the photo back into its frame, a drawer stuck halfway open caught my eye. I pulled it gently, and something shifted inside. At the very back, beneath a stack of old receipts, was another photograph. This one was older, black and white, my father in his Marine uniform, impossibly young, standing at attention, Across his chest, etched into the brass plate, were two words: Semper Fidelis, always faithful. I held the photo in both hands, the irony of it sinking deep. He had spent a lifetime preaching loyalty, but he'd forgotten where it began and who it was meant for. You forgot who you were loyal to. Dad, I whispered. The words didn't come from anger. They came from something quieter, gentler. I smiled, a small, tired smile that felt more like forgiveness than surrender. Maybe, in standing my ground, I'd given that motto back to him in its truest form. I folded my mother's letter carefully, slid it into my bag alongside the photo, and turned toward the door. The house was still, its shadows soft, its silence no longer heavy. When I stepped outside, the afternoon light hit the river just right, silver on the surface, calm beneath. I didn't look back. I left with only what mattered: her words and his lesson. Both transformed. There was no anger left to carry, no victory to cling to, only peace, quiet, steady, and finally mine. 6 months later, the mornings by the coast had turned soft and gray, the kind of quiet that feels like mercy. Mist drifted in from the water, swallowing the edges of the boardwalk and the horizon. I was making coffee when I heard 3 knocks on the door, slow, hesitant, almost apologetic. When I opened it, he was there. My father stood on the threshold, smaller somehow. His once square shoulders had rounded, his posture softened, his hair was almost white now, his face carved by lines that looked less like anger and more like regret. For the first time in my life, Thomas Hart looked uncertain. I didn't say anything. Neither did he, not at first. Then he drew a shaky breath, his voice low, rough around the edges. I didn't know what JAG meant. I leaned against the doorframe. You could have just asked. He nodded, looking down, his hand tightening around the hat he held like an anchor. I looked it up, found articles, read about your cases. You defended men like me once. He paused, his words catching. I was ashamed, not of you, of myself, but I didn't know how to say it. There was no trace of the man who had stood in that courtroom shouting about disgrace. What stood before me was someone stripped bare by time, by consequence, by the truth. I studied his face, the tremor in his jaw, the hollow behind his eyes. For years I had imagined this moment, the day he might finally understand. And yet, standing there, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet ache. You don't deserve forgiveness, Dad, I said softly, but I deserve peace. He blinked, then smiled, small and sad. His eyes glistened, tears clinging stubbornly to the edges. Can I visit her grave? With you? I hesitated for just a second, then nodded. That afternoon, we drove in silence along the coastal road. The sea followed us on one side, restless and endless, waves breaking like slow breaths. The cemetery sat on a rise overlooking the water. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that holds you still. We walked side by side to her grave. The wind carried the scent of salt and wildflowers from the cliffs. He knelt first, setting down a small bouquet of white asters, her favorite. His hands trembled as he adjusted them, the motion deliberate, reverent. His voice came low, almost swallowed by the wind. I didn't do right by either of you. I reached out, brushing my fingers across the smooth stone, tracing her name. My voice came steady, quiet, then start by doing right by her memory. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. For a long time, we just stood there, the sound of waves against the rocks below, gulls crying faintly overhead, the world moving gently around our stillness. There were no apologies left to trade, no explanations that could fix what had been broken, just the simple truth that we were both still here, still trying. When it was time to leave, he reached out and touched my shoulder, a light, trembling touch, but real. I didn't pull away. As we walked back toward the car, I turned once more to look at the sea. The sun had begun to break through the clouds, scattering gold across the water. The light shimmered, soft and wide, stretching all the way to the horizon. He spent years trying to make me small, I thought. But standing here, I finally understood. I never had to grow against him. I just had to grow beyond him. The wind lifted, carrying the faint taste of salt across my lips. I closed my eyes, feeling it move through my hair, my chest, my breath. Somewhere in that quiet rush, I could almost hear her voice again, gentle as the tide. Peace is the final form of justice. And for the first time, I believed her.